Welcome developers to this presentation on EMS Authentication and Authorization. My name is Jim Tierney. I'm a longtime member of the RAD Studio development team here at Embarcadero Technologies. In this presentation, I'm going to build an EMS client application. This client application is going to log in and sign up users, create a user group, and also call a backend endpoint with authorization credentials. I will modify the emsserver.ini file to show how to declare authorization rules, and then I will demonstrate how the authorization rules can allow or deny access to particular resources by particular users. Okay, before I start building a client application, I'm going to run the EMS dev server setup wizard. I want to run the setup wizard so that we can start with a clean EMS server database and a clean emsserver.ini file. The EMS setup wizard runs automatically the first time you run the EMS dev server. This is because the EMS dev server detects whether you have an ini file, and if you don't, it will run the setup wizard to create the ini file and the EMS server database. I'm going to force the EMS dev server to run the setup wizard by passing a command line option when I start the dev server. The command line option is -setup. Okay, this is the setup wizard. I'm going to use the default options except for the one where you specify the directory. I'm going to put in my bin directory for xe7. This way the ini file will be created in an easy to locate directory. This is prompting me to overwrite some files, and that's okay. This is telling me that it created the EMS server database, the ini file, and it also created some sample data. A user called test with a password called testpass and a user group called testgroup that contains the user test. Now I can open the console to see what it shows me. So I'll choose login on the console. I've already logged in the past, so it remembered my password, which is console pass. Under users, I can see our new user test. This message says created by EMS setup, password is test. That's wrong. The password is actually test pass. Under groups, we have test group, and it contains one user, which is test. All right, now I'll create a application. An EMS client application will need an EMS provider component. The server is running on localhost. On port 8080. Test our connection, see that it works. Now I'm going to add a BackendAuth component. This component is going to be used to log in and log out. I'll show the live bindings designer, and we'll hook up some controls to enter the username and password. Choose T-edit and T-edit. Put a button for the login call. So when we click this button, the username and password will be passed to the EMS server, and it'll attempt to log us in. So let's try the application out. Try the username and password created by the EMS setup wizard. All right, there was no error. Let's try something that's invalid and see what happens. We see in that case we get an error. As you can see, I've made some changes. I added a couple of layouts, and I put the controls that we added before into one layout, and then I added a new button, a logout button, and a couple of labels, and put them into another layout. And what I want to do with these two layouts is hide one when the user's logged in and hide the other one when the user's logged out. So I've written some code here that looks at the logged in property of the backend auth login and hides the appropriate layout. I've also added code for the logout button to call the logout method on the BackendAuth component. And the other thing I've done is use live bindings to display the username into the label field here. So what will happen when this application runs is that the first thing is the form create will run. It'll call the show login to show the login layout. And then when we log in, we should see the login panel disappear and the logout panel displayed. So now we see the label populated with the name of the user, logged in user. We can log out and return to the login fields. I think we would like these to be cleared when we log out, so I'm going to go over here to the event handlers for the backend auth component, and in the logout I'm going to call the clear field values method. Now that we've covered logging in and logging out, I'd like to show you how to sign up a new user. I've modified this form by adding a tab control and a tab item for login. And I moved all the components we had before onto the login page. And the sign up tab is where I'd like to add some new controls for signing up. So I'll start out by adding another backend auth component. Call this sign up. And we use the live bindings designer to add some more fields. The live bindings designer creates the controls at the root level of the form rather than within the tab. So I'm going to use the structure view to move those controls so that they're parented by the tab control. I'm hiding the elements that we don't need to see in the live bindings designer to reduce the clutter. In addition to the username and password, I'm going to have another field on this form. What I'd like is to store the email address of any user that signs up. So I'm going to go into the BackendAuth signup component. I'm going to add to this collection of custom user details. Oops. So the detail I'm going to add is called email. You can use user details for other values. Might have address or other kinds of things that you want to keep track of with each signed up user. I've added a field so that the user can type in the email address, and then we'll need a button to sign up. Okay. Now, in order to see what's going on in this sample application, I'm going to display all the users on this page also. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to tell that we actually signed up a user. I'll put a backend query component on this form, and indicate that I wanted to query the users. There's the choices here: groups, users, things that we can query when using EMS. We'll go ahead and link this query component, the result, to a memo. Okay. So this memo will just display the JSON representation of all the users that have been signed up. Turn off word wrap. And we need a button to execute the query. And call Okay, let's give this a try. First, we'll get our users. So we have their user test. That was the one that was created by the setup wizard. And then we'll add a new user, call him A. Let's get the users. We can see that we have a new user, A, and it has an email here. We can go over to our login page and we can log in A. Oops, I see that I didn't parent my memo control correctly, but anyway, we'll log in, and we were able to log in A. All right, now I'd like to talk about groups. So I've added a new tab called Groups, and I'm going to add some controls to add groups and or add a group and view the groups that are in the EMS database. Groups are used to put users into like categories so that when you're authorizing access to a particular resource, you can check whether the user that's making the request is a member of a particular group. So I'm going to put edit control here for a new group. So and we'll put a button to add a group. All right, we'll use the backend groups component to add our group. When we click the button, we'll call backend groups. Create group. We'll give the name of our group. If we wanted to pass custom properties, like for example, we had an email property associated with the user, then we would pass a JSON object here. I'm just going to pass nil in this case, and we pass an entity object, which is going to have information about the group. Then to show groups, we're going to use a backend query. I dropped a memo. We'll link the memo to the backend query component. And we'll add a button to execute the query. Okay, let's go ahead and try that out. Better put the execute method first. Okay, we have the group that was added by the setup wizard. And we'll go ahead and add another group. And there's our additional group. Okay, now we can add some code to add a user to a group. So we'll copy and paste these controls. We'll need a user ID here. And so when we click the button, we'll call our backend groups component. Okay, now we have the code in place to add a user to a group. So when we click this button, it'll add the user identified by this control to the group identified by this control. So here's our groups that we have so far. A group. A group is the one we wanted to add to. We'll need to get a user ID. So I'm going to go ahead and get the users over here, and we'll copy this ID. And add that user to the group. So now when we get to the groups, we'll see that this group, A group, has this user ID. And that user ID happens to be user A. Now I'm going to show how to authorize access to EMS resources using the logged in user. On the login page, I'm going to add some components to execute a request. I'm going to put a backend endpoint component on the page, and I'm going to set a property so that it'll invoke the version resource on the EMS server. It's going to make a GET request to the version resource. I'll also put a button on the form to execute the endpoint. When the button's clicked, we'll execute the endpoint. I'm going to put a memo on the form. I'll use this memo to display the result of the endpoint request. So the response JSON is going to be displayed in the memo after we execute the endpoint request. I'm just going to take a moment to clean up the Live Bindings Designer. All right, so let's go ahead and execute that request. And we can see that we get the JSON. Now what I want to do is pass the logged in user when I make a request to the EMS server using the backend endpoint. So to do this, I'm going to select the endpoint component and set the auth property to our login component. This was the backend auth login component. Whenever we use this login button, the login component is going to keep track of the user that's logged in. If we log out, then it'll clear that information. And because we connected the backend endpoint to that login component, the login component will let the backend endpoint know the information to pass when it makes a request to identify the logged in user. Let's go ahead and run this application now. Right now we're not logged in. If we go over to the EMS server, clear, we'll make a request. And here it says here that the user is blank, or there is no user identified in this request. If we log in with our user A and then make a request, you can see that the request to the version resource has this user identifier, which corresponds to our user called A. If we log out and make a request, then we'll see that once again the user is blank. Now I'm going to show you how to modify the emsserver.ini file to specify access rules. At the bottom of the emsserver.ini file are some comments that describe how to specify access rules. And this is all within this section. I'm going to add a rule for the version resource. This rule is going to indicate that only the user A can execute endpoints within the version resource. The rule applies to users, that's what this means, and then all the users are in a JSON array. So I could add additional users to this array. Okay, I'm saving this file, and I will go over and I need to close the server so that it'll reload the INI file. The log indicates that an access rule has been defined. Now let's run our sample application. So if we try to execute, we're not logged in, we get an unauthorized request error. We'll log in as A, and then our request is allowed. If we log in as a different user, the request is also unauthorized. Now I'm going to make another change to the emsserver.ini file. This time, instead of authorizing based on users, I'm going to authorize based on groups. A group is the group that we created with the sample application. I'm going to save this file. I'm going to stop the server, restart it. Now I'll run the sample application. Not logged in, so unauthorized. Log in as A. A is authorized. Test is not authorized. However, we can add test to our group. And now test is also authorized. Thank you for watching this presentation about EMS Authentication and Authorization. Follow the links below for additional information about EMS.
Well, Jim, thanks for your session on Enterprise Mobility Services, Authentication and Authorization. We do have several different questions that have come in. So first question, in EMS, what is the difference between authentication and authorization, or are they the same thing?
They're related, but they're not the same thing. So authentication would be about validating credentials. So in EMS, you have a username and a password. And when the EMS server receives the username and password that's passed in a REST request, it would verify that those are correct by looking in the EMS database. And then once you have a user that's been authenticated, then you can authorize that user to do particular operations. For example, you might have a custom EMS resource and it has some endpoints. You might want to only authorize particular users to call those endpoints, or you could also have a particular set of users within a group, and you could authorize members of the group to call that endpoint.
Okay, so I saw that you have back-end authentication component. Do you need to have a back-end group to do back-end authentication? Or can you just have an authentication component on its own?
You can have an authentication component on its own. I mean, actually, the authentication component is about authenticating a user using credentials. The group is really more for, authorization. So you create the group separately, and then the group's going to be used on this. If the user that has been authenticated, like as I said before, is a member of a group, then they could be authorized to do particular operations.
Okay. So this is built and uses parts of the REST client libraries, right? Is the REST client library intended for DataSnap or for EMS or both?
Oh, the REST client library. The REST client library was originally developed not to use with DataSnap, but to use with other REST servers, third-party servers, and it supports different kinds of authentication that would be supported by different third-party servers, and it can format requests that are typical of REST servers. So you wouldn't use the REST client library with DataSnap because we have an easier way to talk to DataSnap. Since it's our server, we have clients that are easy to build that talk specifically to DataSnap.
Okay. And then maybe one final question in this DataSnap area. Can a TBackend point work with DataSnap, or is it really just for EMS again?
It's just for EMS or for potentially for other backend providers.
Okay. Let's see. Looks like there were some duplicate questions, so I'll move past again because they were all in that kind of DataSnap. Okay, and duplication, no problem. So my live bindings are a cluttered mess. Not mine personally, but the person asking the question. I notice you've cleaned up live bindings. Does this affect anything? Or how did you get your live bindings to look so nice and uncluttered? Maybe is the question.
Right. Well, you may notice that there's this file with the .vlb extension, and that file is just for design time, and it has information that the live bindings designer uses to position elements and hide elements and that sort of thing. So when you hide an element in the live bindings designer, or you may have not, it may not have been clear from the video that I actually pushed a little button that has a bunch of like a little grid in it, and that does an auto arrange. If you do that, and then when you save your file, it's going to write the information to the .vlb file. That file is only used for design time. You don't need that file when you're running your application. So the answer is, it doesn't affect anything at runtime.
So I noticed there was the EMS provider, and the question here is, can you contrast the use of using the EMS-based components versus using other backends as conveyor parser? Are they similar? I think you showed on the client access that you just have an EMS provider, or you could use some other backend provider?
Right. So there's 3 different providers right now. Actually, there's other providers from other third parties, but the ones that we ship in the product are the EMS provider, the parse provider, and the Kinvi provider. And then there are various backend components like TBackend user, TBackend users, I think.
Backend push, I think, was one.
Yeah, TBackend push, TBackendAuth, and TBackend storage. And so those are all part of this common framework, but they don't all work on all providers. So, for example, right now we don't have support for push notifications in EMS, so that the TBackend push component doesn't work with EMS. And so what happens is when you try to set the TBackend push to reference a provider component, it won't let you set it to EMS because it knows, there's stuff in there. There's registration kind of things that happen that indicate whether a particular provider supports a particular kind of service. Just specifically, EMS supports the users component. There's a TBackend groups, the TBackendAuth.
Okay. And this sort of leads into Luis's question where he asked, do you have future plans for things like storage, push, and other things for EMS in the future?
Yes, we do have plans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any performance metrics on EMS or EMS versus DataSnap REST? Or some thoughts about what guidance we might give people if they're looking at one or the other?
Well, I think, let's see.
I mean, EMS is stateless, right? It just makes a connection.
That's a good point.
Maybe.
So yeah, that would be one difference. I mean, there is a way to make DataSnap more stateless. I mean, but originally it did have the notion of a session, in-memory session. And so when you have an in-memory session, it limits some scalability because that in-memory session isn't going to be shared across processes. But for EMS, from the very, very beginning, we wanted it to be stateless in terms of in-memory state. So all the information about that's needed to make a request or respond to a request is always persisted to the database. And so it's more scalable in the sense that you can easily have multiple processes. Like, for example, you wanted to have multiple Internet Information Server worker processes that were running different EMS ISAPI DLLs. I mean, different loading multiple instances of them. That would be perfectly fine for EMS and be natural. Whereas with DataSnap, you'd have to make sure that you turned on the right flags.
Jim, you showed authentication authorization with EMS, but there was a question that came in about how does this relate to, or who has to do the work to connect and authenticate to SQL databases you might connect to from your EMS server? Is that up to the developer to make the database authorization connection, or is that something that's also provided for through EMS?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so the authentication and the authorization are just for the EMS credentials and the EMS endpoints. So if you wanted to have, you can control which endpoints are called by a particular user or a particular user group, but then when you implement like a custom resource that you've integrated into EMS, it would be your responsibility to decide what credentials to use to access your database. I mean, you could look at what user it is, or you can actually associate data with a user using EMS. So maybe you would actually, when you set up your user, you would put some information in the EMS database along with each user that told you something, a hint about what you should do when you go to access the resource.
So if they were going to connect to Oracle or Interbase, or maybe call a REST server, that it could be associated with their user account, or the app EMS logic could log in a sense and connect as a quote unquote user of that external resource, right?
Yeah. I mean, you might say, for example, that I have a group and I put all the users in different groups, and then the group relates to the actual credentials I want to use on the back end. Is one approach.
Okay. I'm not sure about this one. It's maybe a little complicated, so let me get through it. Can you have multiple back-end authorization components and dynamically switch which back-end points use different back-end auth components? It seems like they're sort of trying to maybe change authentication on the fly, maybe in code or something.
Well, I mean, you might want to do that because, you might authorize some endpoints to be accessible by one user or one user group, and some other endpoints are sort of they're public, right? So in that case, you have different credentials that you want to use. Like let's just say you have. Sometimes you want to call an endpoint with no credentials. You don't care. That's a public. And then sometimes you require like a master key, or sometimes you require a login user. So you could have multiple backend auth components that are set up to use different credentials, and then then you connect the appropriate backend auth component to the appropriate other component. Like for example, let's just say parse or something like that. I mean, the storage component has a property that indicates the backend auth component that's going to be used to authenticate that request. So that's how you would hook it up.
I never thought about having backend points that aren't authenticated, but if you don't have an authorization backend auth on an EMS backend, then it's just publicly available. Any client can call it, right? That's what you're saying?
Well, yeah, by default, they're all public.
Okay.
And then you would go in and go into the emsserver.ini file, and you would, like I showed a little bit in the presentation, you would go in there and declare the authorization rules for particular endpoints or a particular resource. So the way it works is, you have a resource that's usually, the first thing that occurs in the URL. Then after that, you have, depending on the verb, a get would relate to one particular endpoint, or there might be multiple gets, but they're distinguished by the parameters that are passed. So then those are going to be your endpoints, and then you could fine tune the authorization rules to a particular endpoint if you wanted to.
Well, Jim, that's all the questions. There are several people just saying, great presentation, Jim. I think EMS is the future. I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to add after your session is over now, or that's, we had a lot of questions that covered a lot.
Well, I just wanted to say that this was brought up in the presentation about, in the questions about the relationship between EMS and the other parse and Kinvi, and there are some good resources on the web from Serena, for example, about how to use parse and Kinvi, and those can be instructive and relate to how to use EMS.
Okay, and the other provider, I think, was App42 from Shepherd's site. And Serena has information, and she did a webinar previous to CodeRage as well about, so just search for APP42 and REST components or backend as a service, and you'll find more information. They have tutorials, and you can download the App42 provider from their site. It doesn't ship with our product, so that's at least one other provider on the backend as a service side. Okay, Jim, thanks a lot very much. It was great, great CodeRage. Thank you for the session.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure.